Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our weekly COVID update of the 19th of January, a rather rainy day, but we are making pretty good progress as far as the coming down on our fourth wave. Let me get this all up, and we can start. Right. As you can see, this is the NICD dashboard. And yeah, we vary between about 1,500 to about 3,500, 4,000 new cases per day, fluctuating between those figures, still having about 30 deaths per day. The positivity rate, in other words, the percentage of tests which are positive, a good indication of the status of the epidemic, is also coming down quite markedly. So yeah, the fourth wave is coming down, but it is still there. It hasn't disappeared. And we still are getting the kind of dribs and drabs at the end of the fourth wave, the Omicron-driven fourth wave. I apologize, this is a week old. I haven't got the updated one, but I think it basically shows that the curve is coming down quite sharply. It went up sharply, came down sharply. There's a much acuter, much narrower wave than the previous variants, and this is now coming close to the baseline. Again, just to re-emphasize, the hospital admissions quite markedly decoupled from the cases, unlike the previous waves, as well as the death curve as well. I'll just put up the Hatzolah figures to show you that even in the Jewish community, it hasn't totally gone away. Over the last week, ending the end of last week, 103 new cases are still registered on the home monitoring program, and still have 174 active cases on the home monitoring program. So just a caution, we are coming down. We're coming down quite satisfactorily, but however, there is still COVID out there. And I just do need to kind of emphasize that fact. And again, just to reiterate, I did touch on this last week, the mildness of this fourth wave due to Omicron. We can see the number of cases, maybe better shown on this graph than what I showed last week on a table. You can see that the number of cases very much higher than the Delta and the Beta waves, the third and the second wave, respectively, 3 or 4 times the number of cases. But the the percentage of those cases admitted to hospital, very much lower, about a third of the Delta and the Beta waves, the second and third waves. Of those that were admitted to hospital, again with Omicron, a smaller number requiring oxygen, a smaller number who were classified as severe cases, and a quarter approximately of the deaths as compared to the previous waves. Now, what's really intriguing, if you look at the global map of the hotspots of Omicron presently, and I think we know this from the media are very, very high on it's very prominent, the extent of COVID in the industrialized world, in North America, in Europe, Australia, and also to some extent in the South American countries. In contrast to the African continent and parts of Asia, which have been relatively spared in terms of the severity of Omicron. Now, again, in the Northern Sphere, the Omicron is milder than the previous wave because of the extent, it is having quite a significant stress on the hospital system, many severe cases, and also a large number of deaths as well, obviously in the main unvaccinated individuals. But the point where I really wanted to bring out is look at the hotspots of Omicron and you compare it to the vaccination coverage, and you get a completely paradoxical, counterintuitive picture. Because those cases, maybe I'll show you on the comparisons, looks it better. The deeper the green, the higher the vaccination coverage. And it's those countries which have got the highest vaccination coverage, which have actually paradoxically got the highest number of COVID cases. And you can see this in comparing the two global maps, vaccine coverage and hotspots of COVID. And in fact, if you look at the unfortunate situation in Israel, which is one of the highest vaccine coverage countries in the world, now extensively giving a second booster, in other words, 4 doses of Pfizer. And they've got one of the highest cases per capita in the world in Israel. They really are having a very extensive epidemic of COVID, despite the high vaccine. And the recent publication, in fact, demonstrated that even giving a 4th dose, a second booster dose, didn't seem to affect the extent of Omicron infection very significantly. So I dealt with this last week, the reasons why we've got this disparity between the COVID epidemic in South Africa, which had a relatively low vaccine coverage compared to those developed countries. I mentioned last time that it could be artifact, that in fact it could be that we're not testing as much as them, so we're not picking up as much. Of course, many people in this country, South Africa, don't have access to healthcare facilities, so the authorities aren't even aware of their numbers. That may be a factor. Probably the major factor in terms of human factors, the population immunity, as I mentioned last time, both to some extent due to vaccine coverage, but also due to natural immunity or due to a combination of the two. The younger age, we know that the younger individuals, they tolerate the infection better, they tend to have a milder illness. That may play a role. The climate, because we had it in our summer, but of course Australia is also in their summer, that may play somewhat of a role. I think some of reasonable importance is that South Africa does tend to be more conscientious in adhering to the non-pharmaceutical interventions, the infection prevention measures, the masking, the physical distancing, socializing, and so on, than is the case in many European countries, in North America, and so on. So I dealt with these factors last week. What I did promise last week that I'll deal in more detail with the viral factors. Are there, in fact, factors in the virus itself, in the Omicron virus, which makes it a milder illness? Maybe before I get onto that, let me just cover some details to bring us up to date with where we are with vaccination, because really we're just not making too much progress in terms of vaccination coverage. The last 24 hours, there was 86,000 doses of vaccine administered, very, very much lower than the target of 300,000, which we set in August and which we needed to get to if we want to get to reasonable population coverage. So that's really disappointing. And then we look at the elderly, the highest risk group, the 60+ year age group. Basically 4 in 10 individuals in that age group, the vulnerable age group, have not been fully vaccinated. And that's really disappointing where we are in January 2022. So vaccination coverage, not great, unfortunately, and we're not making too much progress there. Just to look again at this dashboard of vaccination coverage, again, I have to do this every week. Just under 30 million doses of vaccine have been administered. Fully vaccinated, the adult population, 41.5%. Looking at the total population, including children and adolescents, 27.3%. Way below the global vaccination coverage of 50.1%. Of the adolescents, that has improved a bit, 18.8%. The third dose of the individual, the older people who were vaccinated 6 months ago, that has improved quite markedly, in fact, since last week. So there is one aspect of vaccination which has improved. That was, in fact, about 1/10 of this figure. But again, it may be some artifact of what is recorded, but certainly the number of people that have come for boosters has increased quite a bit since last week. So there has been a bit of a flurry of people coming for the third doses. That's good news. But vaccination-wise, otherwise, rather disappointing. This is a new chart on the Department of Health where they look at the importance of vaccination, looking at people that are in hospital, what percentage, what proportion have been unvaccinated, that's in this dark red color, as compared to people that have been vaccinated. These are people admitted to the ward in hospital, intensive care and high care. And you're comparing it to different genders and different age groups. And you can see that predominantly it's the unvaccinated who land up in hospital and who get severe disease. And even those who are vaccinated who do land in hospital, probably many of them will have underlying illness. So they're going just this short just to emphasize how important vaccination is in preventing the severe forms of COVID. I'll just point to deaths. This is in the height of the epidemic in South Africa between 7th November, 18th of December. 87% of deaths were in unvaccinated or not fully vaccinated individuals. Again, of the fully vaccinated, 13%, a significant number had underlying illnesses who unfortunately succumbed despite being vaccinated. So now let's go on to the viral factors. And the big question, is Omicron a milder virus? Is it an intrinsic a milder virus? And this, of course, is an important question going into the future. Can we speculate? And I underline and bold the word speculate. Can we speculate that because this is a milder virus, is this the gateway to now the virus is evolving to become an endemic virus? Is it evolving to become, can we look at it in an optimistic way? And I wanted to take you through a little bit of the science to show you why we feel that it is a milder virus. This is a slide I showed in, I think, one of the very, very first COVID updates that I did, just to show you where the coronaviruses fit in generally. We have two groups of coronaviruses. The human coronavirus, these are what we call the endemic coronaviruses. They're endemic because they've been in humans for millennia. And they don't cause too much of a problem. There are four of these. Four of them at the moment, and they cause mild upper respiratory infection. That was a common cold or mild tummy upset, mild gastrointestinal diarrhea and vomiting. Mild tolerable infections, not too serious. Then we have the viruses which have come in from the animal kingdom, where the main reservoir, in fact, bats, and they may be transmitted to humans via some intermediate host, but they are essentially what we call zoonotic. They come from animals, and they get imported into human. They cause then severe disease. They're an unnatural host, and they cause severe disease. So we had SARS-CoV-1, the original severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus, in 2003. That was rapidly brought under control. Similarly, the Middle East respiratory syndrome virus, that was also rapidly brought under control. And now our present COVID, SARS-CoV-2. All of these do cause severe, or can cause severe respiratory, and also infection of the rest of the body, systemic, with blood clotting and so on and so forth, the cause of COVID-19. What we are hoping that eventually this SARS-CoV-2 will become more endemic and then join its fellows over here to become the fifth endemic human coronavirus. That's really what we're kind of hoping will happen. We're speculating that this might happen. So what is the evidence for it? If we look at the Omicron virus itself, I've shown this picture before, we are kind of basically gobsmacked by the number of mutations in the spike protein, that protein which attaches the virus to receptor sites in the cells. There are numerous, more than 50 of these mutations, many of them in the receptor binding domain over here, as compared to the Delta, the previous Superman of coronaviruses. Now, what does this mean? Many of these mutations, I'm sorry about the technicality, many of these mutations are old friends of ours. They've been identified in the previous variants of concern and are associated with escape from immunity, and also the ability to bind effectively to receptor sites and become more transmissible. So we could identify these. There are some mutations which you know what they do, although they weren't present in these other variants. And then there were these large number of mutations over here, which we really don't know what they are. And initially, when we saw this picture over here, we were quite alarmed. We thought, oh gosh, now we've got a virus which is going to be super virulent and it causes a tremendous amount of damage. And as we know, in fact, it didn't. It caused a milder illness, but was far more transmissible and also escaped immunity. In other words, people that had either been vaccinated or had previous infection, they were still getting infected with a milder illness. That was the characteristic of the Omicron. Now let's look at the virus itself. Sorry, this is going to be a little technical, but just bear with me. In cell culture, you can show that the original ancestral virus, the D614G, that caused cells to fuse together to form these giant cells. You can see these large giant cells are fused cells. Omicron doesn't do that. So in cell culture, there's quite a difference between Omicron and the original ancestral virus and also the other variants of concern. So in the laboratory, we can show that there are differences. And these giant cells are bad news from a pathology point of view, particularly in the lung. This is a very dangerous signal of severe disease. And here you can see the damage in cell culture. These are various references, which Delta, the third wave, Delta virus causes in cell culture as compared to Omicron. A very important thing which has been shown in the laboratory is that if we give cell culture from the nose, from the upper respiratory tract, the nose and the throat, Omicron replicates there very effectively because it uses a different route of entry to the other variants. The way that it gets into cells is somewhat different. The Delta virus, it attaches to the receptor site, and it needs this other enzyme on the surface of the cell called TMPRSS2 to get into the cell. Omicron is a bit different. It still needs to attach to ACE2, the receptor site, but it can directly get into the cell. And that gives it an advantage in the upper respiratory tract, the nose and the throat. And therefore, it multiplies to a much higher extent in the upper respiratory, and that's why it's more transmissible. These are experiments done in mice which have been genetically engineered to humanize them. And you can see that Omicron causes a much less disease, using weight loss as one of the parameters, as compared to Delta and one of these other ancestral viruses. And you can see that on this picture over here, that Delta causes much more severe, well, you'll have to believe me if you're not a pathologist, much more severe damage to lungs as compared to Omicron. Yeah, the architecture of the lungs is largely preserved in these experimental mice. And we have a similar thing in hamsters over here, that the pathology is much worse with Delta. So this is a summary of many of these now laboratory tests and tests in laboratory animals, in hamsters and mice, again demonstrating two things. One of them is that in the upper respiratory tract, Omicron is at an advantage. It replicates very much quicker and can spread very much more, as against the lung, where the other variants can replicate very much better, and Omicron doesn't. And that's why we get a much more severe disease in the case of the other variants. Omicron is much milder, but is more infectious. I'm going to carry on with the story in part 3 of this episode to show you why we are a little bit optimistic. So this is the conclusion. This is the punchline of why we are a bit more optimistic in the future, why Omicron may, and I say may and underline may, we may be in for surprises, but may portend that the pandemic is starting to wane. So I'm going to leave it there and leave a little bit of time for questions. I've got a few questions which I'll handle very briefly. The one question, let me get a bit of light here. One question said, why in fact have all these precautions, infection precautions? If, as we see, that Omicron does spread rapidly and cause a mild disease, why not let it in fact run right and kind of, basically immunize individuals, because it causes a very much milder illness? This has been debated for ever since, in fact, COVID came on the scene. There was actually a debate. It was actually called the Great Barrington Declaration, with some scientists got together in a place called Barrington in the United States, and they issued a declaration asking for signatures, in fact, to petition to do away with all the masking and all the infection protection. This is before the vaccine era. However, the one thing that we can do that, but it comes at a great cost. It comes at a great cost, as we can see now, even with Omicron. There's a significant death rate. There's a significant individuals that land up with severe disease in hospital. There's also what we call the long COVID complications which occur even in mild COVID in a certain percent of individuals. So it's going to be a much, much better public health way to keep these infection control procedures and rather rely on vaccine-induced immunity rather than natural. Natural immunity will be there anyway, and we want to supplement it more significantly with that's why vaccination is really the way to go, both to prevent that individuals who may be more susceptible to the more severe disease and also still immunize the population. Then there's a question about relatives coming up from overseas. There's a nursing mother with a 3-month-old baby, worried about the baby. I've mentioned a few times before, babies and children tend to tolerate the infection. In fact, the younger the individual, the better they're going to tolerate the infection. And severe disease in babies of that age is very, very rare. And the reason, because they probably haven't matured those receptor sites for the virus to attach to. So they get a very mild infection. And I wouldn't really be too concerned. Obviously, one takes the usual precautions, but wouldn't be too concerned about a 3-month-old baby contracting the infection. Then another question about why has Australia seen such an upsurge, even though we have a high vaccination rate? Well, we've seen that in countries like Israel and other countries I showed you in the maps. I think that really is the answer to that. And then there's a question about immunizing children under the age of 12 and the age of 5 to 11-year-olds. As I think about 20 countries in the world have rolled out. Unfortunately, the vaccine is actually not registered in this country for pediatric use under the age of 12. And it's not really regarded as a high priority. As I showed you before, particularly in the high-risk groups, there's still a large gap that we need to kind of fill. We're not there yet. So I think it'll be quite a while before we can look at that pediatric immunization. So I think I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you again next week. So have a good day, have a good week, and all the very best. Bye-bye.